Hello there, Richard Westwood here from St Anne's Church in Chasetown with a midweek message for Wednesday the 23rd of November. This coming Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent Sunday, and our midweek messages in the coming weeks as we approach Christmas will be following an Advent theme. For each of the Sundays before Christmas, down the ages, the church has tended to use those 4 Sundays to focus on other people who in Christian history have been good examples of the waiting which is involved in Advent. Advent means before the coming. And in Advent, of course, we're waiting for Christmas, waiting for the celebration of the birth of Jesus. But also in Advent, there's the reminder that Jesus will return again in glory. And we're waiting for that, and also for the fulfillment of all of the purposes and the fullness of God's kingdom when that comes. So Advent is a time of waiting. And in these 4 Sundays before Christmas, the Advent Sundays, the church has remembered the following people. The first Sunday of Advent has a focus on the patriarchs, the kind of mothers and father figures of God's people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Miriam and so forth, and Sarah, Abraham's wife. These are the patriarchs, the starting people who God first called and who responded in one way or another. The patriarchs. The second Sunday focuses on the prophets, people who've spoken God's message to God's people in the past. The third Sunday focuses on John the Baptist. And finally, the fourth Sunday is on Mary, the mother of Jesus. And our midweek messages, as we approach Christmas and travel through Advent, will take on some of those thoughts to see how we can learn from those people as we learn to wait well. And that's, I suppose, if you want a title for our Advent midweek messages, Learning to Wait Well. So today I'd like us to help think through some things in connection with the patriarchs, those early founding fathers and founding mothers of God's people. Like I mentioned, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Miriam, who was Moses' sister, and Sarah, who was the wife of Abraham. And all of those people are at the very early stages of the story of God's people. And I want to particularly today have a think about Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, we read this, verses 1 to 3. God's call to Abraham. The Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's home, and go to a land that I am going to show you. I will give you many descendants, and they will become a great nation. I will bless you and make your name famous, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but I will curse those who curse you. And through you I will bless all nations." There's plenty more of the story of Abram to come. And you'll notice I've said Abram and Abraham. And part of the process that goes on in these chapters of Genesis is how through Genesis chapter 12, 13 and 14, there's a kind of a lumpy and bumpy ride for Abram. And in chapter 15, his name is changed to Abraham. More of that in a moment. It's worth knowing that when God calls Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis to leave his homeland, to leave his family clan, and to leave the neighbourhood that he was dwelling in, this was a deeply unusual thing to do for the peoples he was part of, partially nomadic, but certainly living in family groups and tribes. For someone to say to someone, you need to leave the people who you are with, leave your family clan, it would be almost unheard of to do such a thing. And so God, in this process, is in asking Abram to do something very, very countercultural, out of the norm of what people around him are doing. I can imagine the sort of conversations that must have happened between Abram and Haran, his father, who would have been, I suppose, the kind of guiding figure of that clan group, or his wife Sarai. Abraham says, well, God's told me I've got to leave and take my family to a land God's going to show me. And they might well say, Haran and Sarai might say, well, great, where is this land? I don't know, says Abram. God says he's going to show me. So Abram is being asked by God to do something very, very unusual. Not only to leave his family clan, but to go to a place that he doesn't even know where it is until God gets him on the road, if you like. God's asking Abram to do something really quite unusual. But notice this is at God's initiative. The Lord calls to Abram. This isn't some brainwave that Abram has. And this next stage is, I think, a remarkable one, because as we move into verse 4, it tells us Abram was 75 years old. He started out from Haran as the Lord had told him to do. So despite whatever hesitations there would have been for his family clan, despite he might be perhaps considered on the older end of things at 75, Abram still goes and does what God has asked him to do, even though probably he may have been the first person to have done some sort of response to God as God was beginning to engage with people in this way. As we look forward, into the following chapters of chapters 13 and 14 of Genesis, we learn that there's some bumpy roads that go ahead. Abram doesn't always get it right. There's a bit of cowardice and uncertainty, and the road isn't straightforward. But remarkably, God perseveres with Abram. Because Abram has responded, God bears with and overcomes the difficulties that Abraham's behaviour actually puts in the way. God is persistent and keeps Abram going, even when actually Abram's approach isn't as good as it could have been. Abram wobbles, if you like, but God stays steadfast. And then in chapter 15, where the discussion is between God and between Abram about descendants, key feature of anyone at that time, about the family line. In Genesis chapter 15 verse 1, we hear this. After this, Abram had a vision and heard the Lord say to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I will shield you from danger and will give you a great reward." And some translations say, "And I will be your great reward." But Abram answered, "Sovereign Lord, what will you give me? What will be your reward to me, since I have no children? My only heir will be Eliezer of Damascus. You have given me no children, and one of my slaves will inherit my property." Reading forward, it then says, "Then he heard the Lord speaking to him, 'This slave Eliezer will not inherit your property. Your own son will be your heir.' The Lord took him outside and said, 'Look at the sky and try to count the stars. You will have as many descendants as that.' Abram, it says, put his trust in the Lord, and because of this, the Lord was pleased with him and accepted him." Again, other translations say, Abram trusted the Lord, believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So there's a kind of growing journey for Abram here, and as he goes on this journey with God, he seems to learn more about God in the process, and God reveals more of himself as Abram's journey continues. And this faithful response of Abram is acknowledged by God as Abram continues to walk. So for us then, what can we learn from this mini portion of the story of God's people, Abram and those living with him at the time? Well, firstly, waiting for God is not something that is a passive thing. Abram could have said, "Well, God, thank you for calling me. Thank you for this invitation to go away. But when you've let me know where you want me to go, then I'll be able to explain to my family what's involved, and then we can go." It seems that Abram needed to act only with the information that he had, which may not have been as much as he would have wanted. If you like, sitting on our hands is not really a faithful response. And from Abram's point of view, I guess his lesson to us is it's an active journey. This journey of waiting for God's purposes to be fulfilled for us is not one that we sit down and passively wait like we're in the doctor's waiting room, waiting for the next step. It is a journey, and as we're on that journey, we're able to then to be steered, if you like, by God in that process. Someone said to me, "You can't steer a stationary ship," and as we move, we're able to be steered by God. Secondly, I think Abram teaches us that trusting what the Lord has said he will do is an important part of our waiting. Whatever God has said to us, either personally, individually, or to us all through the Bible or through the message that Jesus has brought to us, whatever God has said, God will do. And trusting that is an important part of our waiting, even if as yet we can't see how that's going to be fulfilled. Abraham was someone who discovered that God was faithful, but he only seemed to discover that as he stepped along that journey. My guess is that Abraham would have had many questions when he was called by God. But I guess the faithful response and the waiting bit of that is that he doesn't let his questions stop him journeying with God. He seems to be able to walk with his questions and trust that God will be able to answer those questions as God journeys with Abram. I guess part of this process for us as well is about being willing to do something which is against the normal culture, doing something which is countercultural. Our waiting isn't, our waiting for God's kingdom isn't something which is something that most people in our community will do. Our looking forward to seeing what God is going to do in us, in our church, in our community, in our country, and in the world. That's not something that everyone's looking to do. Not everyone's having that sort of thought. So part of our looking forward and our waiting is countercultural. And it will involve doing things that will perhaps seem unusual or out of step with what many people who don't have a faith would think would be normal in these times. Someone said to me a good while ago, faith is spelled unusually. It isn't spelt as you would think. It's spelt R-I-S-K, risk. And the walk of faith, which Abrams shows, is an active waiting, seeking and believing that God is going to fulfill his purposes, even though we yet don't see how he's going to do that. And living in a faithful response to that is part of our waiting journey. A prayer. Lord, we want to learn to wait well for your kingdom. We thank you for faithful people in the past and the history of God's people who have learned well how to walk with you even when things don't seem clear. Thank you for that active and travelling waiting that Abram undertakes. And because he trusted you, Lord, you credited to him as righteousness. So, Lord, help us to wait well for the fulfillment of your purposes, for the returning glory of Jesus. Lord, help us to be prepared to do things which might seem unusual to those around us. Help us to take you at your word. And help us, Lord, to walk even though we might have questions, trusting that you'll give us the answer we need when we need it. Help us, Lord, to wait well for your kingdom to come in all its fullness. Amen. Thanks for listening and watching. I hope you have a good week and that your Advent is a good one. God bless.